There are so many great albums that are completely overshadowed because of the time when they came out or the position in that artist's discography. I'm going to pull a few from my collection. We're going to highlight 10 overshadowed albums that rock on this episode of Talking About Records. My name is G.I. Sanders from NTX Vinyl, a small chain of independent record shops in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. If you're not local but you are in the U.S., you can shop online at ntxvinyl.com, and would love it if you'd subscribe to our channel here on YouTube and follow us across social media on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok at NTX Vinyl is the handle. All right, let's talk about overshadowed albums that rock. This is a category that I kind of came up with. I've done videos in the past on like underrated albums, and I think there's a lot of crossover there. But for this specifically, for this topic, I was trying to think of bands that have, discographies of at least a couple records, and they had one big record or a run of a couple big records. And then there's that outlier of the album that either came before or it came after. And it just gets overshadowed, not because it's not a great album. And if you're a big fan of a specific artist and you love their whole discography, well, it certainly wouldn't feel overshadowed to you personally. But like broadly speaking, when you think of a certain artist, normally, or when most people think of a certain artist, a specific album or two come to mind, and it's usually not one of these. I will also say, most of these are more kind of modern artists, not because there's not overshadowed artists across or albums across, all eras and all genres. I was just kind of in the mindset of thinking about more modern artists. So most of these that are going to pick out are of that flavor, not all. But so let's start off with one. This is the album that actually gave me the idea for the topic, and it's quite obvious. The majority of these are going to be big name artists because in order to be overshadowed, you have to have something to cast the shadow. And if you're going to talk about an album that probably gets overshadowed more than any other, I would start with Bleach by Nirvana. Came out in 1989, and obviously it is the precursor to Nevermind. Again, this is the album that gave me the idea for this topic because I was thinking, man, it's just a shame how few people probably own this album and know this album. But it is absolutely fantastic. And I listened to it recently, just by chance, put it on. And, it's been a while, honestly. I probably haven't listened to it in, I don't know, a year or something like that. I have no idea, honestly. But it's been a while since I really, really soaked it in. And it really struck me because it's so raw and it's so different than Nevermind. And I think In Utero ended up being the kind of middle ground, the blend between Bleach and Nevermind, honestly, because it's got some accessibility, but it's also a very raw album, being their third record. But going back to the very beginning, this is pre-Dave Grohl, and it is pre-alternative and grunge, if you will, as far as being in the mainstream. But if you listen to, you can listen to interviews, especially with Dave Grohl before he joined the band, and him and Kim Thayil from Soundgarden, guys like that, they spoke very highly of Bleach. They, if you listen to interviews by them, they're saying that this album was hugely influential in that scene, and everyone absolutely loved it. No one knew what was going to happen, a year or two later, but the evidence is here on the recording. I love the fact it says on the back it was recorded for $600 by Jack Endino. And the rawness of this album, that's what's so great about it. It's literally just three guys in a room slamming their instruments against the wall. It's so garage rocky and grungy, if you will, and rough around the edges, and that's what makes it so great. But there are some great hooks, whether it be vocal and lyric hooks or guitar hooks. You know, in my opinion, the only real single on this was About a Girl, as far as something that would be kind of radio friendly, and that went on to be a little more well known because they covered it in the Unplugged album. But songs like Love Buzz, Negative Creep, um, Paper Cuts, School, Scoff. It's just it's amazing all the way through. Oh, they did have Jason Everman on guitar on this as well, so technically a 4-piece. But yeah, this is the quintessential like Overshadowed album, because then Nevermind comes, blows up in the mainstream, and of course, you know, this album has gone on to sell tons and tons of records. But to my point at the beginning, if you say Nirvana, 99% of the people in the world who know what Nirvana is as a band, they're going to think of Nevermind, and that's why this started off this list, because it is greatly overshadowed. So there you go. First on the list, Nirvana, Bleach. Next up, this is, I think, yeah, definitely the oldest album on this list. And I've talked about this one a lot before, and it's an interesting one. This is Metal by Pink Floyd. A phenomenal album, which includes, you know, 2 of my favorite Pink Floyd songs ever, and that would be Fearless. And then also on side 2, the entire side, is the song Echoes. This is the precursor album or 2 before Dark Side of the Moon. So similar case to Bleach, but obviously Pink Floyd had an entire career essentially before the Dark Side of the Moon era with Syd Barrett. But this is, in my mind, this is kind of Roger Waters going, okay, this is where we're going to head. And I love that about this album, because you can hear where he's going, I think, in a lot of ways. And then just, you know, a couple of years later, you have the run of Dark Side and Wish You Were Here and Animals in the Wall, which, again, if you say Pink Floyd, to most people, Metal is not an album that's going to come to mind, you know, very quickly in that conversation. In fact, most people probably don't know more than, you know, Dark Side and The Wall. And again, generalizing about just the normal general public who understand music, right? But this is an album, I think there's a great level of experimentation on it, but again, some phenomenal lyrics and phenomenal songwriting from Roger Waters. So I really appreciate this record. And I honestly didn't get exposed to this record till years into my rock and roll education, if you will, in high school. Like, again, because I just knew Dark Side and The Wall and Probably Wish You Were Here. Animals and Metal, I think, are the ones that kind of get left off the shelf just because they didn't have the big singles. You don't hear a lot of songs off Metal. You don't hear a lot of songs off Animals necessarily on the radio, not compared to those other albums. So for me, Metal is definitely one that gets overshadowed, but it is a fantastic record, and I encourage you to check it out if you're not already familiar with it. All right. Next on the list, how about some Tom Petty? This was an interesting one. He's got obviously a very deep discography, but I had to choose this album, Echo. This is one that does not get a lot of attention, and I do think it's overshadowed. Originally came out in 1999. One of my favorite things about this album, or one of the reasons that I think it stands out, is it's the last record with Howie Epstein on bass. And he was a phenomenal bass player and an incredible vocalist, and harmonized so great with Tom. So that's one of the things that I always think of. It's produced by Rick Rubin. I think it gets overshadowed in Tom Petty's discography in that kind of mid to late 90s period, mainly because you had the album Wildflowers, which came out 5 years before. But Wildflowers was hugely popular. It was a massive success at radio. It was kind of, in a lot of ways, responsible for reviving Tom's career. And so again, if you think of 90s Tom Petty, most people, myself included, think of Wildflowers. But this album is really, really great. You've got songs like Room at the Top. Swingin' is a fantastic song. The title track is great. Billy the Kid. Again, just a lot of great hooks and great songwriting from Tom Petty, and I really appreciate this record a lot. I think the production's great on it from Rick Rubin, again, coming out of that relationship that they forged with Wildflowers and kind of Tom, and kind of, again, where his career was headed. I think that was a pinnacle point in the mid-90s with his relationship with Rick Rubin, and I think this album stands the test of time for sure. When Tom passed away, I remember Room at the Top was the first song that I gravitated towards. and listened to a lot. It was hard during that period, but great album, and definitely recommend Echo if you're not familiar. Next on the list, how about some Black Crowes? So the Black Crowes come out of the gate with Shake Your Moneymaker, huge radio album, massive, still played on classic rock radio to this day. Southern Harmony was also pretty big with Thorn on My Pride and Remedy. Arguably their best record, Amorica, came next. I think that's when they really hit their stride and found that blend between kind of Southern rock and psychedelic rock, if you will. They started getting into more kind of like jam band type of vibe, which I love. So that's a big run of the first three records, right? Ending up with Amorica as their third release, which again is my favorite and I think contains some of their absolute fantastic tracks. And then comes Three Snakes. Three Snakes is an album that I think gets overshadowed because it comes after that run. And like most bands, you know, the fandom is cyclical. So you have a lot of people who love a band when they first come out. And then, you know, they tail off after 2-3 albums or whatever. And so by the time you get the Three Snakes, like, you know, a lot of those fans who really only knew and loved the band for Shake Your Moneymaker tunes, you know, She Talks to Angels and stuff like that, like they're not still around. And so this is kind of that album to me where the Crowes make a decision and go, okay, we're gonna be a career band and we're gonna stick with this and we're gonna continue to evolve. I think that's the biggest thing on this album, is the evolution and kind of their sound. If you listen to songs, not so much the album, the singles, which there's not a ton of singles as far as radio is concerned, but the album tracks, the album cuts, like How Much for Your Wings, Let Me Share the Ride, Girl from a Pawn Shop. I think probably the only song that got any radio play off this was Good Friday, which is a fantastic song. This is kind of the sound, if you will, Amorica and Three Snakes, kind of the sound of the band imploding. You know, there was a lot of tension during this, especially coming out of Amorica, where Rich and Chris were at each other's throats, and you know, they infamously recorded that album more than once and then re-recorded it. So, you know, the fact that they held on and put out such a great fourth record like Three Snakes, I absolutely love it. I think there's some standout tracks here, but again, I don't think the casual Black Crowes fan probably knows any more than Good Friday, if I had to guess, because there's just not anything else on here. Not a ton that the band keeps in rotation live either, which is another one of the reasons I think I would put this in the overshadowed category. So. All right, next on the list. This is a similar one in regards to the precursor, right? This is Summer Teeth by Wilco, a beautiful record, but a year or two later is when Yankee Foxtrot Hotel comes out. So this one gets overshadowed because of the success of that album, and rightfully so. But I love this record because it's the transition record for Wilco in my eyes, because you've got their early records, AM and Being There, which were coming out of Uncle Tupelo and were very Americana, very country, very rootsy driven, you know, some Southern kind of stuff in there, rock. And then you have Yankee Foxtrot, where the ship has sailed on that vibe, and they're going into much more alternative indie in experimental phase, right? So then you've got Summer Teeth wedged right in between there, and I think it is that neat transition, if you will. Songs like Can't Stand It, She's a Jar. One of my favorite Wilco's tunes ever is A Shot in the Arm. Absolutely love it. Pigeonholed and Sweet. Via Chicago is another standout. The title track, Candy Floss. So again, an album that I think just gets overlooked because of time and place. And looking back on the whole discography, it's easy to skip over it, especially if you're a fan of those earlier records, which I am as well. And there's a lot of people who put, you know, AM or Being There as like the top Wilco album, regardless of Yankee Foxtrot. But this is a fantastic record in my opinion, and a lot of these songs are staples for the band live, which is a testament to how good some of it is. I think Jeff Tweedy, again, was really hitting his stride from a songwriting standpoint, and the band's really hitting their stride. And you can just hear the progression coming from those earlier records, heading to Yankee Foxtrot, where they were going. And I think Summer Teeth is a great album in that vein, and I absolutely love this record. Standout live tracks via Chicago and Shot in the Arm, absolutely fabulous. So check out Summer Teeth if you're not familiar with that one. Next on the list, so you know I'm a Soundgarden fan, or you might know I'm a Soundgarden fan. It's hard to follow up an album like Super Unknown. That's what the band did with Down on the Upside. You know, they have a long history and a discography leading up to, you know, their major label breakthrough with Louder Than Love, and then of course Bad Motorfinger hits right around the time of, you know, the grunge explosion. And then you had the band go into the studio and record, in most people's opinions, myself included, their absolute masterpiece, which was Super Unknown, and then they got to follow it up. Well, they did follow it up with Down the Upside. It's a fabulous record. It's a really interesting record. It had huge radio hits on it, but regardless, I think it's still overshadowed because of Super Unknown. And then again, this is kind of, I think I've already said it more than once, but this is kind of the sound of a band breaking up, because they didn't last much longer after Down the Upside was released, and they did the Down the Upside tour, and then they kind of imploded and they were just done. They got back together, thankfully, and did some great shows and a great album in King Animal. But this album, the big singles were Blow Up the Outside World and Burden in My Hand. Fabulous. Pretty Noose was a pretty big single as well. But I love the album cuts. I love Ty Cobb. I love Dusty. I love Applebite. I love No Attention. There is some serious punk vibe on this record. This is compared to Super Unknown, which was more of almost like a Physical Graffiti type of album to me. And then you had Bad Motorfinger, which was really heavy hitting. This one's got more variation on it, I think, than any Soundgarden record. And I think that's a testament to Chris Cornell and how much his songwriting was evolving. So at this point, you know, 96, when this comes out, you know, he's been writing songs for 10, 12 years at that point, and heavily since the late 80s when Soundgarden was formed. So, you know, he's come into his own at this point, and I think it shows when he can write, you know, huge radio hits like Burden in My Hand, but then he can come off and write, you know, Boot Camp or Overfloater, or just some of these songs that, again, album tracks. Rhinosaur is a fantastic song as well. Some of the album tracks I think are the standouts here. I saw the band on the Down the Upside tour, which was Lollapalooza. I guess it was Lollapalooza 96 or 97, whatever, whichever one that was, when Metallica was headlining. So it was Metallica and Soundgarden. Fantastic show. Screaming Trees were on that bill as well. I think Rancid was as well, maybe the Melvins. Just a great record. Love Down on the Upside. Was super bummed when the band split up after this, but after seeing them live, wasn't real surprised, because they weren't really into it, and you could tell like it had been a while and they were ready for a break. So there you go. Down the Upside, definitely an underrated record, an overshadowed record from the greatness of Soundgarden. Let's talk about, this is a very similar story right here. You're going to talk about Red Hot Chili Peppers. Again, several records, early records, almost independent, underground. Then they break out with Mother's Milk, had some success mainstream wise. And again, then Blood Sugar Sex Magic hits, and at the, you know, the pinnacle of the alternative boom, and is a massive success with Under the Bridge and Give It Away. Then you got to follow it up. But even worse for the Chili Peppers is John Frusciante left the band. That leaves you with One Hot Minute, which is an album that most Chili Peppers fans completely disregard. In fact, I would argue and say the band themselves disregard. I think a lot of that is just because Frusciante wasn't on the album, but they got Dave Navarro from Jane's Addiction. You know, he's no schlump, and I think he brings a really cool edge to this record. The lead single was Warped, right? Yeah, lead single and lead track is Warped. Aeroplane was probably the biggest radio single. But you've got some really great tracks on this. My Friends was a really cool, gentle Chili Peppers tune. I love Walkabout, the title track, Shallow Be Thy Name. There's, again, Shallow Be Thy Game, actually. Just some great songs. And a pretty straightforward record. It's got a little diversity on it with some of the more chill songs. But again, just completely overlooked when you squeeze it in between an album like Californication, which had arguably bigger radio hits, and then obviously Blood Sugar. It's just one that gets overshadowed. It's just, you look at the whole discography, and I think there's very few people who will call out One Hot Minute when you say, what's your favorite Chili Peppers album, or what's one that sneaks up on you. I think a lot of people would go towards, some of their other records. So for me, One Hot Minute is kind of a hidden gem that a lot of people don't know, and definitely overshadowed in their discography. So check that one out if you're not familiar. Couple more to go. Speaking of Dave Navarro, Jane's Addiction put out 2 full-length records, Nothing Shocking and Ritual. They were massively successful. The band transformed the landscape of music in the mainstream, and Perry Farrell obviously went on founded Lollapalooza and took that torch and carried it through, and that was a game changer for the festival and the concert industry, and still is to this day. And then the band was gone from 90 until 2003 when they released Strays. So this is kind of the epitome of being overshadowed, because those early Jane's records are what everybody thinks of, and rightfully so. They were massive, but don't sleep on Strays. It was, almost 15 years later from the band's previous, full-length Ritual. They reconvened with this album and were headlining Lollapalooza in 2003, along with, I saw the tour, was with Audioslave, Queens of the Stone Age. I want to say Incubus was on that bill, and Jane's. Unbelievable show. This album, I think, standouts. You've got True Nature was, Just Because, I think, was the main initial single. But True Nature, I think maybe was a single, or at least quite popular as well. But the album tracks on here, I love Price I Pay. I love The Riches. Superhero, which is a song that was the intro song to what was that damn show on HBO? I'm not going to think of it off the top of my head, but it was about the guys in LA that were movie stars. And I can't think of the name of it right now, but someone's going to call me out on it. But it was the Superhero was the intro to that song. And you've just got a great record, a very hard record to find on vinyl. Unfortunately, it's definitely due for a reissue. And I was just excited to get a chance to see the band, because I never saw them in the early days, late 80s, early 90s. I was just too young. So when they reconvened and I got a chance to hear this album live as well as the earlier stuff, was super jazzed about that. And again, yeah, overshadowed, but great songwriting, great hooks, definitely overdue for an album after, again, 13, 14 years or whatever in tour. So it was fantastic to see Strays come out, and an album I still love. It definitely needs a reissue. Let's talk about one of my favorite bands, My Morning Jacket. I love this band. This is Z. I would say this is a bit overshadowed just because the band's, I guess, breakthrough would be considered the album before this, which was It Still Moves, and that's kind of when the band went from being a little bit just completely underground to being a little more mainstream, playing bigger venues, if you will, on It Still Moves. And then Z hits. This is, I don't think to My Morning Jacket's fans, it's overshadowed, but again, I'm talking kind of mainstream. But this album is the one that kind of opened my eyes. Like, I knew It Still Moves a little bit, but when this came out and I heard Off the Record, and I heard Wordless Chorus and It Beats for You and Gideon and Anytime, just fantastic tracks, all staples that the band play to this day. So again, not overshadowed to the big MMJ fan, but I think, not a lot of people know this record. Not a lot of people know this band at all, even for radio play or mainstream awareness. I think most of it is driven by their hardcore fan base who followed the band around, such a touring entity, and rightfully so, because they're a fantastic live band. So Z is maybe my favorite in their discography, despite it being overshadowed. It is a fantastic record, and I would definitely encourage you to check it out if you're not familiar with the band. I think it's a great starting point for the band as well, which is important in conversations like these if you've never listened to them. Last but not least, I will not continue to repeat myself, But again, a similar story, because when you're trying to follow up an album like The Downward Spiral, it's not easy. But Trent Reznor did it, and he did it with The Fragile, maybe the most overshadowed record on this whole list, other than Bleach, I would say, because The Downward Spiral was just huge. It took Nine Inch Nails from, being, Pretty Hate Machine, Broken era, which was eye-opening and game-changing in so many ways, but then The Downward Spiral hits, and you see and you hear what Trent is really capable of. And they toured The Downward Spiral for years. I think they came through Dallas alone 3 or 4 times. I know I caught them twice. And then there was a long break where Trent had to recover from that, and what he had gotten himself into. And then about 5 years later, The Fragile drops, and it's a double CD, 3 LP. And I remember the title track, or not the title track, but the lead single, "We're in This Together," drops. I think that was the first one, but and I was all in. Like, I was so excited to hear what he would come up with next. But it was relatively, I don't want to say it wasn't well received. Just times had changed. This is 1999 versus 1994, so the landscape of music was drastically different in the mainstream, and radio wasn't giving this the time of day like they should have. But the album tracks on this, The Wretched, and just so many. I need to take it out to go through some of these tracks. I saw the band on this tour, think twice. The Day the World Went Away, The Frail, The Wretched, We're in This Together, I mentioned. The title track's fabulous. The Way Out is through, Into the Void, Where Is Everybody? I could go on and on and on. This has got some cool kind of unreleased stuff on it as well, I think, Underneath It All and Ripe to end it off. But man, just a phenomenal album from Trent and company that I think cemented, at least for me, that, oh man, this is, again, like, you just know he's in it at that point for the long haul, versus like you could see a scenario where after The Downward Spiral and everything that was then changing in music, I was afraid he wasn't going to come back. It was five long years, so it was fantastic to get that much music of that high quality from Trent Reznor. And then he went on to follow it up with even, in my opinion, just as good albums with Teeth is fantastic. And Year Zero is a fantastic record. I could go on and on, but there you go. There's some overshadowed albums that rock. This is honestly a pretty fun topic. I could dive into just like R&B or jazz or 70s rock or something, and do a lot of offshoots. So I might do that in the future. But for these, most of these being modern, other than the Pink Floyd, but they were just ones that were kind of top of mind for me. And artists that I think are big enough to cast the shadow. That's the other thing. You can't really be overshadowed unless you've got a big enough space to fill. So hope you enjoyed this topic. I'd love to hear your thoughts on whether or not you think these are overshadowed, and more importantly, some other albums that are overshadowed, because maybe that'll give me some more fodder for future videos. So thanks for watching. As always, my name is G.I. Sanders. This has been Talking About Records, and we'll see you again next time.